All right, so today we're talking about the Cold Bullet from Wizard with a Gun. And now we can break it down a little bit. So this is the sound of the default bullet on the pistol specifically with no spells. But in order to create the sounds of the spells in the game, most of the sound of that gunshot needs to get out of the way of everything else. So what I did is I stripped that down to more of its basic components and then split it up here into two tracks to allow for adjustments both in timing and volume. And that takes a whole back half of that trail out to give more room for everything else that happens. So in this track here, we have glass breaking run through a couple of different effects, whereas that is otherwise just the sound itself. Now, thematically, there are going to be a lot of consistencies here in this sound because you want to stick to elements that are appropriate for what you're trying to make. So a lot of this is going to be ice, jingly things, glass, anything sparkly sounding. There really are just the main like 3 or 4 components to this in a bunch of different forms. Here's the next one, which I believe is the back half of a magic ice spell that I actually got from a different library, which is just like this dry. Not especially interesting all on its own otherwise. This track here is just something to add a little bit of sweetness to the front, give it a little bit more hit for the initial firing. Basically just white noise. It's actually the beginning piece of a whole ice breaking spell here, but I just needed the front. This track here, we've got more glass. Very little even done to this one, just adds a little bit of transient to the beginning and more of that sparkly glass tone that you get. And this one's a little bit interesting because it is still also glass, but a classic sound design trick for Magic is to take glass, run it through a delay, and reverse it. So that's just a broken glass played backwards with effects. And that layer just does that. Now we've got some more dry stuff, just the tiniest little sparkle. Barely noticeable, but adds a little bit more sharpness to the front end. This here is a set of chains, used more for the effect itself than what the dry signal brings to it because it's a very sparse, limited sound. But it just allows that tail to come out the end on the other side. This one here is more broken glass. Very little done to it. A lot of these early glass breaking sounds are all here for the purpose of giving the initial shot a really hard single strike sound to go with the firing of the main bullet. Because there's nothing glassy or icy about that. So you add all of these other elements in the same way with that really hard singular, it's called a transient. Gives it more ice-based life. This here is more glass, shards. Once again, just a lot of the same thing. Very little done to it. Now these two layers here, I wanted to include an element of like blowing wind, like a breezy blizzard, like howling wind kind of element to the shot itself as it formed the ice on the ground underneath of it. But I was actually kind of struggling to get it to work. So these two are not in this sound, but I thought it was an interesting thing to bring up because I'm sure it'll show up eventually. This is an element that's actually really important in the initial gunshot sound. That tail at the end that gives it that really nice sense of like an outdoor echo almost, that dispersion of sound into the wind of the outdoors. Incredibly difficult to synthesize. So you add stuff like this just to give it a little bit more realism, to place it in the actual environment. Because without it, this is with, it just doesn't have like that large echo out the back. Second half of the sound is the ice trail itself. And this is a lot more of the same kind of thing. We've got chains. But the approach that I wanted to take with this piece of the sound here, as you can see in the animation, it starts and then it goes to an end. And one of the ways that I like to think about sound is to think of it in its most fundamental physical basics of how sound works, as it is just energy dispersed through air to cause vibrations. And so if you think about the energy of anything happening, the energy from the spell energy, fires out and creates this path of ice until the energy effectively dissipates and stops. And that's what causes the path to stop being created. And so I wanted the ice trail to have this element of finality, of coming to a point, to getting thinner and quieter as the energy that's causing the trail to be created is also creating the sound of that trail and dispersing along with it. So anything that sounds loud with all of the different parts of the frequency spectrum, high and low, the bigger the sound, the more energy it has. The reverse also being true. Less is quieter. So this goes from having more robustness to it and then tapering out to really high and thin on all of these tracks for this effect. And this one here is almost nothing. I have almost nothing done to this because this is just ice. But I love that squeakiness on the back half of it. The way that that tapers down to like that pressure of, when you twist ice, when you compress it, you get that little squeaky sound. Beautiful. Love it. This here's just more ice, which also starts off with more low end and then comes up to high points. And that is mostly synthetic because this is actually a much larger sound as it was recorded from ice on a lake. This is one of my favorite ice tricks, is to take little tiny pieces of white noise and just scatter them around. It gives it more of a sharpness to it, that high, thin, sizzly kind of sound. And once again, that same taper from bottom to top. This is actually an electricity sound, but it's a synthetic electrical sound. So it's made from like cellophane or something, run through a bunch of different processing, and it brings a lot of crunchiness, a lot of sharpness to the overall sound of this. Keeping all of the layers of this section very thin because we don't want it to overpower all of the other stuff going on, especially the tail from the initial shot and whatever else might be happening at the same time. This is another pre-made magical ice spell that I'm repurposing for something else. I didn't make it, but it's in my library of stuff. And here it is with nothing on it. And it's almost watery. It seems more like a slush kind of sound, but just run it through there and give it that tremolo, that that stuttering kind of effect. There's more dynamic in that. You don't want just this constant sound. You've got all of these little ice crystals sort of forming very quickly, and each one of those you could consider to be a separate entity of something. So you want to have a lot of variety, a lot of crunchiness, a lot of build in how dynamic ice sounds are. And this last track is just some white noise for a couple of reasons. One, I find white noise to be really, really great for filling in the gaps of the frequencies where stuff otherwise doesn't really go. Like if you had a jar or like a bucket that you were filling up with big rocks, you have all of this airspace between them where there's nothing. But if you filled that up with sand, you have these very small granular bits because white noise covers the entire frequency spectrum. So you just take the white noise and you use it to fill in the gaps. It gives the sound much more of a fullness and can bring a lot of stuff together. It's almost like a glue. And this also is great for giving this whole piece a nice sense of motion. Because if you get rid of that, it just doesn't work quite as well. Great. And then this layer here is just a little bit of an afterthought, actually, that I had, where you've got the ice on the ground after the trail has formed, but I wanted to give it sort of a settling, like when you put ice in a glass of water and it sits there and it settles and there's no motion or anything, but you can hear the transfer of energy as things start to cool off and warm up and the ice cracks and you get these little crunchy sort of tiny little sounds of the settling ice. I really like that a lot. I think it does a lot for the whole picture of this particular sound effect. And so now once again, the whole thing. Oh, and just that little guy at the end. I love it. And now this here is the sound of the bullet actually hitting the ground, but then there will also be elements of it used for when it hits any particular enemy or anything like that. But primarily, these tracks are all part of the same thing. I have a default ground hit for when the bullets hit any sort of like cement. bullet hits rocks. Not a whole lot to it, but I added some additional elements to give it more of an icy flavor. And this is just more ice with very little done to it. This is your classic white noise trick once again. Very, very, very small and minor, but adds some sharpness to this other piece of the track. And now this here, just another glass recording. Same kind of effect. Has that nice, clean, sharp hit in the front with the delay running out the back end. Now this is just a variation. There are a handful of variations. This particular Ice Trail sequence has like 5 or 6 different versions that play randomly to give it more flavor. And the shot itself has a collection of different boxes full of different layers, different versions of each layer. Like if I took this one and then I had 5 more of these that were similar but different and did that for 60% of the layers in this sound, and then you set them all up to pull something randomly from each of those boxes every time it plays. So you effectively take one sound and turn it into 1,000. And it does a lot to help keep things from ever sounding repetitive in game. It's one of my favorite things about sound design in games is the ability to create a lot of randomness through automation instead of having to manually do it over and over and over again yourself, which is great. And that is going to be it for this presentation. Thanks. Hooray for us all.